My name is Hannah Pierce and I was 43 years old, standing in my father's kitchen an hour after his funeral, when my oldest brother laid a realtor's business card beside the salt shaker and said we should try to get the house photographed before the hydrangeas died. He said it in the tone people use when they believe they are making a practical observation rather than crossing a moral line. For a second I did not answer him. I looked at the card. I looked at the table. I looked at the vase of grocery store lilies one of my father's old church friends had brought after the graveside service and set down in the place where my mother used to keep peaches in summer. Then I looked at Caleb. He was 48. He had our father's shoulders and our grandfather's certainty and the specific confidence of a man who had spent most of his adult life assuming that nearness counted as effort. My sister Rebecca was at the counter rinsing coffee cups that did not need rinsing, which was how she managed tension when she wanted to appear useful rather than involved. My younger brother Lucas was in the doorway to the mudroom scrolling through his phone with the expression of someone hoping the argument would organize itself around other people. The funeral food was still on the sideboard: deviled eggs, ham biscuit, 2 untouched lemon squares under plastic wrap. My father had been buried 53 minutes earlier in the cemetery behind First Baptist and my family, apparently, had moved directly into discussing curb appeal. I said, "What realtor?" Caleb did not look up from the card. He tapped it once with his forefinger and said, "Marianne Boyle, local office. She knows the market. We figured if we move quickly, we can have the place listed before the end of the month." That was the first thing I noticed, not the sale, the pronoun. Rebecca turned off the faucet and dried her hands on a dish towel. She said, "Caleb's just trying to get ahead of things." I said, "Ahead of what?" Lucas finally looked up from his phone. He said, "Hannah, come on. There are families in which that sentence means please be reasonable. In mine it meant please don't make the thing we are already doing harder by asking whether we should be doing it." I picked up the realtor's card. The edges were crisp. She had written her cell number on the back in blue ink and circled it twice, which told me this had not been a casual thought that occurred to Caleb while the coffee brewed after the funeral. This had been arranged, discussed, advanced further than I had been meant to know. I put the card back on the table. "Dad was in the ground less than an hour ago," I said. Caleb shrugged once, lightly, as though the line between grief and logistics was one he had crossed so often it no longer required noticing. He said, "Which is exactly why we need to deal with the house now. Nobody's moving back in here. The taxes aren't nothing. The roof's going to need work in another year or two. There's no point letting it sit." He said all of this while standing under the copper pans my mother had hung from a rack in 1997 and polished every November whether company was coming or not. He said it in the kitchen where my father had taught all 3 of us boys and girls equal, as he liked to say, how to change a washer and reset a breaker and sharpen a lawnmower blade with a file. He said it with his tie still loosened from the funeral and mud on the hem of his black slack from the cemetery. And I realized, not for the first time in my life, that proximity can make people careless. My father's name was Thomas Pierce. He was 78 when he died, and for most of my life he had been the sort of man other people described as steady because they did not live in the house with him long enough to understand the difference between steadiness and emotional economy. He was not cruel. I want to say that clearly because stories like this become easier when someone can be named the villain, and my father was not one. He was a man who believed in repair, in work done before complaint, in paying the electric bill on time, in showing love by replacing a storm door before winter rather than by saying anything unnecessarily tender in October. My mother had provided the tenderness. My father had provided the walls around it. She had been dead for 23 years when he died. Her name was Margaret Pierce, and she had an illness that took her slowly enough for all of us to mistake adaptation for coping. By the time I was 16, I knew how to lift her from the chair in the den to the bed in the back room without hurting her pride more than her shoulder. By 17, I knew the schedule for her medication better than my own class timetable. By 18, I had become what every family becomes in the presence of a long illness if they are not careful, which is a set of roles hardened into identity. Caleb was the dependable son because he lived close and could mow the yard. Rebecca was the organized daughter because she remembered appointments and birthdays. Lucas was the youngest and therefore, by family law if not actual fairness, the least expected to absorb damage. And I was the strong one. If you have ever been called the strong one in a family, you know that what it often means is not that people admire your strength. It means they have quietly decided how much of their own weight they can place on your back without asking first. My grandmother Lillian, my mother's mother, had understood this before anyone else did. She died this summer after I graduated high school and left me $28,000 in a certificate of deposit, not because she loved me more than the others but because she said, in the direct way old women sometimes say the truest things in a room, that I was the one whose future kept getting postponed in the service of everybody else's present. The money was for college, specifically for nursing school. I had been admitted to the state university 90 miles away with a partial scholarship, and the CD was enough to close the gap between what aid covered and what life cost. I never used it. That part matters, but not yet. What mattered on the day of my father's funeral funeral was that my siblings were standing in his kitchen behaving as though the house had already become an object that required management rather than a place that had just lost its last living witness. Rebecca said, more gently than Caleb but no less firmly, nobody's trying to rush you. We're just talking through next steps. I looked at her. She was 45, 3 years younger than Caleb and 2 older than me, and she had spent most of our adult lives mastering the art of sounding conciliatory while advancing the position she preferred. She lived 20 minutes away in the next town over, had 2 sons in college and a husband who sold insurance and called everybody friend. She visited Dad every Thursday. She brought casseroles when the weather changed and labeled freezer containers in a handwriting so neat it looked reprinted. And because she had done these things visibly, because she had done them within county lines and church circles and familiar roads, my family treated her care as self-evident. Mine had been harder to count. I said, when exactly were you planning to mention this? Lucas pushed himself off the mudroom doorframe. He said, mention what? The realtor. Caleb answered before Lucas could. He said, we're mentioning it now. No, I said, you arranged it before now. You discussed it before now. You decided there was a we before I walked into this kitchen. There was a silence after that, the kind that arrives when everyone in a room recognizes that the accurate sentence has been spoken by the person they were hoping to cast as difficult. Then Caleb did the thing he always did when confronted with accuracy. He reached for practicality the way some men reach for a weapon. He said, Hannah, you live 800 miles away. We're the ones who have to handle the clearing out. We're the ones who'll be here meeting contractors if anything goes wrong. We're the ones who've been here. The last sentence hung there. I had heard versions of it for 24 years. When Mom got worse and I left for school anyway because the deferred scholarship was expiring and another year of waiting would have turned postponement into surrender, I became the one who had left. When I moved to Chicago after graduation because the hospital that hired me offered night shift, union pay, and a city in which no one knew me first as the girl who had abandoned a sick mother, I became the one who had gone too far. When I married and later divorced a man my family had met exactly twice and formed opinions about in under 40 minutes, I became the one who didn't consult anybody before making permanent decisions. When I did not bring my daughter, Emma, down for every Thanksgiving because driving 12 hours with a child and a schedule and a custody agreement was not actually the simple matter my siblings imagined, I became the one who kept her distant. Families are excellent at counting the miles other people travel. They are much worse at counting the cost. I said, yes, you've been here. Caleb nodded, as though that settled something. I said, and because you've been here, you think the house is yours to sell. Rebecca inhaled through her nose. Lucas looked back at his phone, which was what he did when he wanted the room to believe he was absent from a conversation he was quietly choosing not to complicate. Caleb said, nobody said that. I looked down at Marianne Boyle's card beside the salt shaker. You didn't have to. Before he could answer, there was a knock at the back door. Not the front, the back, which immediately told me whoever it was had either known my father very well or had been told to use the door family used. Rebecca set the towel down. Caleb glanced toward the mudroom. Lucas straightened. I was nearest the door, so I opened it. A woman I did not recognize stood on the porch in a navy wool coat, holding a leather folder against her ribs. She was in her early 60s, neat silver hair, low practical heels, the expression of someone who had spent enough time around bereavement to know that timing is often the only kindness professionals can still control. She said, Hannah Pierce. Not are you Hannah Pierce? Just my name, stated carefully and correctly. I said yes. She nodded once. I'm Andrea Bell, your father's attorney. He asked me to come by today after the service if all the children were present. All the children. Something in my body went still. Caleb stepped forward behind me. Rebecca moved closer from the sink. Lucas slid the phone into his pocket. I opened the door wider and Andrea Bell came into my father's kitchen like someone entering a room where the emotional weather had already been forecast. She set the folder on the table exactly where the realtor's card had been and moved the card 2 inches to the side with one efficient motion that I still think about, because there are people who can rearrange the moral center of a room without ever raising their voice. Your father left instructions, she said. They concern the house specifically, so it seemed best to address them before any assumptions became decisions. Caleb said, assumptions. Andrea Bell did not look at him. She opened the folder. Your father's will is straightforward in most respects. Personal accounts are divided equally among the 4 of you after expenses. Tangible personal property is to be distributed according to the memorandum attached to the will. However, the house at 19 Briar Lane is not part of the probate estate. Rebecca frowned. What do you mean it's not part of the estate? Andrea slid one paper from the folder and turned it toward us. Because title transferred 7 years ago. There are moments in families when the air seems to retract, not disappear, pull back, as though the room itself is making space for the sentence to land. Caleb stepped closer and looked down at the page. Rebecca came around the table. Lucas said, no, immediately and too quickly, like someone rejecting pain before it fully identifies itself. I did not move at first. Then I saw the line where Andrea's finger rested. Grantor, Thomas Edward Pierce. Grantee, Hannah Elise Pierce. Instrument, transfer on death deed with retained life estate. Recorded, 7 years, 4 months, and 11 days earlier. My name sat there in county print with the specific authority of paper that has already outlived argument. I heard Rebecca say, "That has to be a mistake." Andrea looked at her with professional patience. "It is not a mistake." Caleb said, "Dad would have told us." Andrea closed the folder halfway. "No," she said. "He very specifically did not want to tell you." That sentence shifted the room more than the deed had. Because a mistake is easier to challenge than intention. Lucas looked at me then, properly looked at me, with a kind of disorientation I had not seen on his face since he was 14, and our mother's breathing changed one night while he was setting the table and he realized adults could lose control of a room without warning. I said, "I didn't know." It came out quieter than I intended, and I do not know whether any of them believed me. Andrea did. She said, "Your father left a sealed letter with the deed packet to be given to Hannah after his funeral and not before. He also left copies of the recording, tax history, and the life estate reservation. The deed is valid and was executed in my office in the presence of 2 witnesses and a physician's capacity statement because he anticipated possible disagreement." Caleb laughed once, but it was not humor. It was the short, involuntary sound people make when they encounter planning they had not included themselves in. "Possible disagreement," he said. Andrea met his eyes for the first time. "Your father was not a careless man." "No, he was not. He was many things. Proud, economical with words, capable of going days in one's presence without saying anything untrue and yet somehow leaving the most important truth unstated. But careless he was not." Rebecca folded her arms. "Why would he do this?" Andrea reached into the folder and drew out a cream envelope with my name written on the front in my father's block handwriting. Not elegant, not soft, precise, upright, practical handwriting that made every letter look as though it had been measured first. "He answered that himself," she said. "I have not read it." She slid the envelope across the table toward me. I did not take it immediately. For 24 years my father had sent me birthday cards with 2 sentences in them. Merry Christmas notes with 1 enclosed check until I asked him to stop sending checks because I was 36 and the gesture no longer meant what either of us pretended it meant. Occasional messages relayed through Rebecca that began with "Your father wants you to know" and ended with some practical fact about weather, health, or a roof repair I had not been invited to witness. What he had never sent me was an explanation. And now one sat on the kitchen table between a realtor's card and the folded funeral bulletin from First Baptist Church, waiting for me to pick it up in front of the siblings who had already been deciding what to do with his house. Before I tell you what was in the letter, please hit like and subscribe. Drop your city and local time in the comments. I read every single one. Now let me take you back to where this really started. Not to the deed, not to the funeral, further back, to a house that became a debt before it became an inheritance, and to a daughter who was called strong often enough that everyone in the family forgot strength was not the same thing as endless willingness. The house on Briar Lane was built in 1958 by a contractor named Dale Whitcomb who cut corners where they would not show and overbuilt where they would. My father bought it in 1984 when Caleb was 8, Rebecca was 5, I was 2, and Lucas had not yet arrived. It had 3 bedrooms, 1.5 baths, a sloped yard, a screened porch my mother loved immediately, and a kitchen window over the sink that looked onto a red maple which was then thin enough to ignore and by the time I left home was thick enough to cast the whole back side of the house in shade by 3 in the afternoon. My father loved the house for practical reasons: good framing, solid basement, street that held value. My mother loved it because the light in the dining room stayed warm an hour longer than in the rental they had been living in before, and because there was a patch near the fence where basil took to the soil as though it had been waiting for her specifically. I loved it because children love what contains them before they have any ability to assess its cost. The cost arrived later. My father ran a small engine repair shop for most of my childhood. Not a chain, not a franchise, not a thing that scaled. It was him and 2 other men and a radio at the back counter and hands that smelled permanently of oil, soap, and cold metal in winter. It paid enough, then less than enough, then briefly more than enough when a landscaping boom passed through the county in the 90s, then less again after a bad expansion decision that my father would later refer to only as the second location, as though refusing to name the mistake more fully might limit its size in memory. My mother taught elementary school until her body made that impossible. She was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis when I was 13, though if you ask anyone who was there, the disease had arrived years before under other names. Fatigue, clumsiness, stress. Then the names got more expensive. MRI, progression, decline, adaptation, equipment. In families built around work, illness reorganizes the moral structure faster than anybody admit. The chores increase, the tenderness thins, the person most visibly in need becomes the center, and everybody else slides into roles based on who resists least. I resisted less than the others, not because I was nobler, because I was good at it, because I could anticipate what my mother needed before she spoke, because I had the kind of face adults mistake for calm when it is actually concentration, Because my father, under pressure, tended to become more procedural and less available, and somebody had to notice that my mother liked the tea hot but not scalding, that the blanket on her legs needed folding twice at the ankles so her feet did not ache, that the hallway light after midnight made her feel exposed if the bedroom door was open. Caleb mowed the lawn and learned enough at the shop to be useful beside my father. Rebecca handled calendars and church calls and thank you note. Lucas was young enough, for a while, to remain simply loved, and I became the one who stayed near. When my grandmother Lillian left me the CD, my mother cried. Not when she read the amount, when she read the note attached to it. For Hannah, because usefulness is not the same thing as having a future. I did not understand the note fully at 18. I understand it now. The money sat untouched for 8 months after her funeral. I had deferred college for 1 year because my mother's condition had worsened and my father asked, not in so many words but clearly enough, whether I could wait. He said we need one steady thing in this house right now, and I was young enough to hear the praise before I heard the theft hidden inside it. I stayed. Then the second location failed. The repair shop debt tightened. Insurance refused more than it approved. My mother needed modifications in the house we did not have cash for. A ramp, a wider doorway into the downstairs bath, a chair lift we never bought because even discussing the staircase aloud seemed, to my father, like surrender. One night in February, 3 weeks before my college deferral paperwork became irreversible, my parents sat me at the kitchen table. I remember the yellow overhead light. I remember the smell of Vicks on my mother's robe. I remember my father flattening the old bank envelope with his thumb before he spoke, which was how he handled conversations that embarrassed him. He said the mortgage note was due. He said the refinancing had fallen through. He said the bank would extend only if we showed immediate liquidity, and he used that phrase, immediate liquidity, as if placing the problem inside a financial vocabulary might make it less humiliating to ask his 19-year-old daughter for college money. My mother did not ask directly. She cried and apologized and said if there were another way. My father said it would only be temporary. 6 months, he said. Maybe a year. I said yes before either of them finished explaining. Not because I had no imagination. Because the house still felt to me like a collective structure rather than the place where some people's futures were being stored at the expense of others. The bank got the money the following Tuesday. The house stayed. The repayment never came. That spring my college called twice about enrollment. My scholarship would not defer again. The nursing program had a wait list. If I did not come in August, the seat would go to someone else. I told my father this standing beside the freezer in the garage while he looked for a wrench he had misplaced. He said, then maybe this isn't the year. I said, there isn't another year. He found the wrench. He did not look at me. He said, your mother can't be left alone all day. That sentence, more than the money, is what changed the shape of my life. Not because it was false. Because it was offered as fact by a man who had decided the problem belonged to me before asking what it cost. I left 3 months later. This is the part my family tells differently. Their version is that I chose school over my sick mother. That I packed in anger. That my father said if you walk out now, don't expect this house to wait for you. And I walked out anyway. None of that is inaccurate exactly. It is only incomplete. What happened was this. My mother called me into her bedroom the night before I left. Caleb was working late. Rebecca had gone home from helping with laundry. Lucas was with friends. My father was asleep in his chair in the living room because exhaustion had made honesty easier than posture. My mother asked me to close the door. Then she said, you cannot give this house your whole life and call it love. I sat on the edge of the bed and cried, and she held my wrist because her hands were too weak by then to hold much else for long. She said go tomorrow. She said do not stay because people confuse your staying with virtue. She said they will praise you for it right up until it becomes convenient to say you never left because you had nowhere else to go. She said go before your life becomes the thing this family keeps borrowing against. I think about that sentence more now than I did then. My father drove me to school the next morning in silence so complete that even the radio seemed intrusive. He unloaded my boxes. He shook my hand instead of hugging me, which was not his normal way, and I knew in the moment that he was trying to make departure feel contractual because if he let it feel like grief he might say something he had not budgeted for. Then he said the sentence that became family history. If you leave when your family needs you most, don't expect this house to call you back. I remember every word because some sentences are built to last longer than the people who say them. I got out of the truck anyway. My mother died 6 months later. I came home for the funeral and slept at Rebecca's apartment because my father did not ask me to stay at the house and I had already learned the difference between what a person means and what they merely fail to offer. After the funeral, I went back to school. After school, I moved to Chicago. After Chicago, my life began in earnest, though not before passing through several years in which guilt and freedom were so tightly braided I could no longer tell which one was making me tired. My father and I did not stop speaking. That would have been easier in some ways. We entered instead into a thinner arrangement. Birthday cards, Christmas cards, news transmitted like weather. Caleb married. Rebecca had her first son. Lucas changed jobs again. The maple tree had to come down after after a storm cracked the trunk. My father's blood pressure was high. The old Labrador died. The roof was pat, not replaced, pat. Every update carried the same shape, information without invitation. I was never told not to come home. I was simply never asked. There is a distinction there that matters very much if you are the sort of person who takes people at the most accurate version of what they actually offer. I married at 29, divorced at 36, had my daughter in the middle of those years, and for a while the logistics of being a single mother with rotating hospital shifts and a child who needed braces and algebra help and rides to debate tournaments did what time alone cannot always do, which was make my distance from home look less like principal and more like ordinary adulthood. My siblings interpreted it the way that benefited them. Caleb called on holidays and said you should really come down more often. Rebecca said Dad notices when you miss Easter. Lucas sent casual text with photographs from the porch, the yard, the old dogwood tree in spring, the kind of messages that imply inclusion while requiring nothing costly from the sender. None of them ever said come stay in your old room. None of them said I told Dad to ask you. None of them said we have remembered what the house cost you, because I do not think any of them remembered at all. By the time my father had his first heart attack, 17 years had passed since I left. Rebecca called from the hospital parking lot and said he keeps asking whether you know, which I understood to mean he wanted me informed but not summoned. I flew down anyway. I sat with him after surgery while the monitors clicked and the nurse changed in 4 bag. He asked about Emma's school. He asked whether I was still working night. He asked whether Chicago winters were as bad as people said. He did not ask me to come by the house before my flight the next morning. I stayed at a Marriott off the interstate. That detail matters to me in a way it may not matter to anyone else. Not because the hotel was bad. It was fine. Because staying in a hotel 20 minutes from the house where you were raised teaches you something final about the architecture of exclusion. It is possible to be near a place without being welcome inside it in any way that still feels like belonging. 7 years before my father died, he came to Chicago once. He said it was for a shop equipment expo outside Joliet. I believed him until the second day when he asked, carefully and too casually, whether I had time for lunch near my apartment rather than near the expo center. He arrived in the same brown jacket he wore to church when the weather turned and carried a manila envelope under his arm that he never opened. We sat in a diner with cracked red booths and he asked more questions than usual. About Emma, about my work, about whether I was renting or had bought the condo, about whether the school district where I lived was good enough if I stayed there long term. At the end of lunch, he took the envelope out and put it on the table. He said, I need your current legal name for some paperwork. I said, what paperwork? He said, property paperwork. I assumed taxes, emergency contact, something practical connected to aid. He had turned 71 that year and his face had thinned in the way older men's faces do when they begin losing not health exactly but the extra margin they once wore against it. I wrote my full name on the back of the receipt. Hannah Elise Pierce. Same as always. He folded it and put it in the envelope. Then he said thank you and changed the subject to Emma's piano lessons. I did not think about that lunch again until Andrea Bell set the deed on the kitchen table after his funeral. Back in the present, standing with my father's envelope in my hand and my siblings arranged around me like badly placed furniture in a house suddenly not behaving as expected, I understood 2 things at once. The first was that my father had made a decision 7 years earlier and then protected it with medical documentation, witness signatures, and legal recording, which meant this was not sentiment, impulse, or confusion. The second was that he had done all of that without telling me. Andrea Bell said, there is one more instruction. Your father asked that Hannah read the letter privately before any further discussion. Caleb said absolutely not. Andrea looked at him. It is not a request from you. Rebecca said, if this concerns the house, it concerns all of us. Andrea said, the deed concerns all of you. The letter is addressed to Hannah. Lucas rubbed a hand over his mouth and looked out the window toward the backyard where the dogwood had been cut down years earlier and the grass had never fully recovered the shape of the shade. I slipped my finger under the envelope flap. My father's handwriting stared up at me from one folded page and then another beneath it. The first line said, the house was yours the winter we used your grandmother's money to keep it. And that was where everything I thought I knew about silence in my family began to rearrange itself. I read that first sentence twice, not because I did not understand it, because I did. There are truths that require time only when they are complicated. This one was not complicated at all. It was simple, exact, and old enough that the fact of its simplicity felt like a cruelty. The house was yours the winter we used your grandmother's money to keep it. My father had written in black ink on lined legal paper. Same upright letters, same pressure on the downstroke. The lines were slightly shakier than they would have been 20 years earlier, but not much. He had always written the way he lived, with deliberate economy and no faith in flourish. I said, I'm going upstairs. Caleb took one step forward. Hannah, Andrea Bell said, let her go. I did not look at any of them as I crossed the hall. I took the stairs that still dipped on the 4th step from the bottom where the wood had loosened before I was born. I passed the family photographs on the wall, most of them older than my daughter order, all of them arranged by my mother with the confidence of a woman who believed chronology and affection should be visible from the hallway. My room had become a guest room 15 years earlier. The wallpaper was different. The desk was gone. The cedar chest remained under the window because nobody in my family had ever been able to agree on whether it was valuable enough to move or sentimental enough to respect. I sat on the edge of the bedspread and kept reading. Your siblings believe proximity is the same thing as contribution, the letter said. That is not entirely their fault. It is what they could see. But a house is not held up only by the people who stand nearest to it. Sometimes it is held up by the one who paid for the foundation and then had the manners not to mention it every Christmas. That sentence made me laugh once, sharply, against my will. Not because it was funny, because it was my father, belatedly, attempting wit in the service of confession. The letter went on. I told myself for many years that I would repay you and then put the title right. First when the shop recovered, then when the note was reduced, then when your mother was gone and I could think clearly, then when I sold the extra lot, then when Lucas finished school, then when Caleb needed help with his second mortgage, then when Rebecca's husband was between jobs. There was always a reason to postpone fairness when the unfair arrangement benefited the rest of us. I stopped reading there and looked out the window toward the backyard. The maple my father had mentioned in cards was gone now, just as Lucas's photographs had shown, but I could still see the place where it had stood. Families are like that. Remove the thing itself and the shape remains in the ground longer than anyone wants to admit. My father had written Caleb's name, Rebecca's, Lucas's, mine. No euphemism. No family softened into abstraction. He had named the mortgage, the money, the postponement. The fact that my leaving had been interpreted as abandonment partly because that interpretation made it easier for everyone else to live inside the house without remembering whose future had gone into its walls. There are apologies that arrive too late to function as repair but not too late to function as truth. My father's letter was one of those. He wrote that he did not transfer the house immediately because pride is slow to surrender ownership, especially in men who have spent their lives believing that what they pay for is what they are. He wrote that after his heart attack he began making lists, first of tools and account numbers and insurance policies, then of debts that had not been financial for a very long time. You were the largest of those debts, he wrote, because what was owed to you was not only money. Then a paragraph below. When you left for school, I let the family believe anger was the whole story because anger was simpler than admitting shame. If I had said plainly that we kept this house by taking your college money and then asked you to stay 1 year longer with your mother and then acted surprised when you chose a life that was still available to you, I would have had to stand inside the full size of what I was asking. I did not. That was the first line in the letter that made me cry. Not because I had spent 24 years waiting for it, because I had spent 24 years pretending I did not need it. Have you ever spent so long surviving a family version of events that the truth, when it finally arrives, feels less like vindication and more like fatigue? Tell me in the comment. I read every one. And subscribe if you're still with me, because the letter was only the first part. What I found in the cedar chest after that is what made my brother put the realtor's card back in his pocket and stop talking about listing dates. I kept reading. Your mother knew before I did that if you came back after building your own life, this family would ask of you what it had always asked, which was the largest share of invisible labor and the smallest right to object. She was not wrong. When she told you to go, she was correcting something in me that I had not yet admitted. When I said the house would not call you back, I intended punishment. What I created instead was a kind of exile I lacked the courage to undo. There are sentences you feel physically, as though they pass not through comprehension first but through bone. What I created instead was a kind of exile. I read that line 3 times. Below it, my father explained the transfer. He had executed the deed 7 years earlier, the month after he came to Chicago. He wrote that the lunch in the diner and the request for my full legal name were not about taxes but about title preparation. He wrote that he had sat in Andrea Bell's office with the draft in front of him and understood, with what he called unwelcome clarity, that the only fair arrangement left was to acknowledge publicly on paper what he had not acknowledged privately in speech. The house had been preserved with my future and occupied by everyone else. He reserved a life estate because, as he put it, I was too old to start over and too proud to ask the child I had already sent away whether I might remain in the place her money saved. Then came the paragraph that answered the question I had spent years not asking directly because I was never sure I wanted to hear the answer. I did not invite you home because every invitation I drafted felt dishonest. To ask you back without repaying what was taken would have made your presence a second extraction. To ask you back and then hand you work, as we always would have made me the same man twice. Silence was cowardly, but it was the only cowardice I could manage without making a greater use of you. I lowered the paper after that and sat very still. My siblings' version of my absence had always been clean. My father was disappointed. I had chosen distance. He had let distance stand. Their story contained resentment, maybe disappointment, but not complexity. Complexity is harder to live with because it demands redistribution of blame, and blame in families has a way of calcifying around the person least interested in defending herself. What my father was describing was not mercy exactly. It was shame disciplined into restraint, which is not the same thing as love but is sometimes the only shape love can take when character fails before feeling does. He wrote that he had kept a file. It is in the cedar chest under the window in your old room, he said. Bottom false panel. Andrea does not know about it because it is not legal property. It is record. I looked at the chest. Then I set the letter down, crossed the room, and knelt on the old rug my mother had once turned and turned again so the frayed corner stayed under the bed. The chest smelled faintly of cedar and old linen. Inside were guest blanket, 2 yellowing tablecloths, an Afghan Rebecca made in high school and hated because the edges curled. At the bottom, under the lining paper, I found the panel. It lifted on the left side where the wood had warped. Under it was a narrow packet tied with blue ribbon and a small cashier's envelope from Farmers Trust Bank. I sat back on my heels and opened the envelope first. Inside was the deposit slip from the day my grandmother's certificate of deposit had been cashed. $28,000. Payable to Thomas Pierce mortgage account. Signed on the back by Hannah E. Pierce. The handwriting was mine at 19. Rounder, quicker, more willing. Behind the deposit slip was the original note my grandmother had attached to the CD when she left it to me. For Hannah. Because usefulness is not the same thing as having a future. And behind that was a letter from my mother in an unsealed envelope with my name written across the front. I knew her handwriting before I fully saw it. She had looped her Y's and crossed her T's too high. My hand started shaking before I opened it. The letter was short. 2 pages. No date. If your father gives you this, it means he has finally decided that silence has become more shameful than truth, she wrote. If he does not, then perhaps you will find it some other way, which would not surprise me. Your father mistakes endurance for virtue in himself more often than in other people, but he is not an evil man. He is simply a proud one, and pride ages badly. I smiled through tears at that because it was her voice exactly, affectionate and unsparing in the same breath. She wrote that she had argued with him about the money after the bank meeting. She wrote that she had wanted the CD restored before another kitchen chair was bought, another repair delayed, another sibling crisis solved at my expense. She wrote that he believed there would be time. She wrote that both of them had borrowed against my future because illness narrows moral vision inside a house and that by the time she understood how thoroughly the role of strong one had attached itself to me, I had already started confusing obligation with identity. Then this: if the house ever becomes yours on paper, know that it was yours in fact the day your money kept us inside it. If it does not, then know it anyway. A truth is not made less true because the documents are late. I sat on the floor with both letters in my lap and felt, more strongly than I had at the funeral, that grief is rarely one feeling at a time. I was grieving my father. I was grieving my mother again. I was grieving the 19-year-old version of myself who had thought being asked meant being important and had not yet learned that some families praise the child they are most comfortable sacrificing. Below my mother's letter was a spiral notebook. On the front, in my father's handwriting, house ledger. Inside, in dated entries that covered 15 years, was a record not of mortgage payments or repairs exactly, though those were there, but of what he called offset. My grandmother's money, entered on the first page in block letters and underlined twice. Then notes across the years that reflected every time some piece of family economics had leaned on me without public acknowledgement. 2009, Hannah paid for furnace replacement after insurance dispute, refused reimbursement. 2011, Hannah covered 3 months of supplemental care after my surgery. 2014, Hannah sent money for Lucas's dental work because he was between jobs, did not ask if it was repaid. 2016, Hannah purchased Dare Lift deposit after Rebecca said county support was delayed. I had forgotten some of those things. Or not forgotten exactly. Filed them under family. My father had not forgotten them. He had been keeping score, but not in the way I had imagined vindictive people keep score. Not to use later. To finally make visible what had never been entered into the official account. At the back of the notebook, written 2 years before he died, was one final entry. House title prepared to correct what cannot be repaid in full. I closed the notebook and sat there until someone knocked on the bedroom door. It was Rebecca. She did not open it. She said through the wood, "Hannah." I said yes. She said, "Andrea is leaving soon. Caleb wants to talk." Of course he did. When I opened the door, Rebecca's eyes went immediately to the letters in my hand and then to the packet under my arm. She looked tired in a way she had not at the funeral. Not softer exactly, more rearranged. She said, "What did he say?" I looked at her. "What do you think he said?" She shook her head. "Once. I don't know anymore." That was the first fully honest thing any of my siblings had said all day. We went downstairs together. Caleb was standing by the kitchen sink with both hands braced on the counter. Lucas sat at the table, staring at the deed copy as though enough attention might alter its content. Andrea Bell had her coat back on and was placing documents into separate labeled envelopes. Caleb looked up when I entered. He said, "Were you really going to let us talk about selling it without saying anything?" I almost laughed. I said, "I found out about the deed 20 minutes before you did." He looked at my face, then at the letters, then back at the counter. Andrea said, "If there are legal Legal questions, I can answer those now. Personal ones, I suggest you schedule for a day when no one has also been to a graveside service. Nobody smiled. I set the deposit slip and my mother's note on the table. Then I set down the ledger. Caleb frowned. What is that? I said, record. Rebecca took the deposit slip first. Her eyes moved across the page. I watched comprehension reach her in stages, which is how it reaches most people when what they are understanding requires them to reinterpret not one moment but 20 years of family assumption. She said, this is your college money. Yes. Lucas looked up sharply. What college money? Rebecca passed him the slip. Caleb did not take it from her. He looked at me instead. You never said anything. No, I said. I didn't. Why not? Because none of you asked what paid for staying in this house, I said. You only asked why I left it. That landed the way true things usually do in families, not with drama, with a silence so complete it changes the weight of ordinary objects in the room. Lucas read the ledger next. By the time he reached the entries about the furnace and the stair lift, his ears had gone red. Rebecca stood very still holding my mother's letter but not yet reading it. Caleb finally took the notebook from Lucas and turned pages faster than the content deserved, as if speed itself might reduce the authority of the record. He said, Dad wrote this. Yes. And Mom knew. I looked at the letter in Rebecca's hands. Yes. Rebecca read the first page in silence. Her mouth changed first, then her shoulders. When she finished, she folded the paper once, carefully, like someone trying not to injure a thing that had already done its damage. Lucas said, I didn't know. I believed him. He had been too young when the money changed hands and too self-protective through his 20s to notice where relief was coming from as long as somebody offered it before the crisis reached him personally. Rebecca said, I didn't know either. That was also true, though differently. She had been old enough to know the family was always one invoice away from strain, but she had not known which hidden account had absorbed the shock. Then we all looked at Caleb. He closed the ledger and set it down. He did not deny it. He did not claim ignorance immediately. He looked at the sink, then the window, then the table. Finally he said, I knew the money came from somewhere. I waited. He said, Dad told me back then it was handled. Handled. There are words that reveal an entire moral training in a family. Handled was one of ours. I said, by me. He rubbed one hand over his jaw. I was 24. I had just started at the shop full time. Mom was getting worse. Dad said not to make more of it than it already was. That was the closest Caleb had ever come to admitting that convenience had masqueraded as innocence in our family for years. Andrea Bell closed her folder. Mr. Pierce made his decision with full knowledge of what he was doing. If any of you intend to challenge the transfer, I recommend you first read the capacity statement, the deed record, and whatever personal documents Hannah chooses to share. Then decide whether your objection is legal or emotional. The law is interested in only one of those. With that, she left. The back door closed behind her. No one spoke for several seconds after that. Then Caleb said, what are you going to do? Not with the documents. With the house. I looked around the kitchen. The copper pans. The basil pot, empty now. The worn chair by the mudroom where my father used to sit to untie his boots without tracking grease through the hall. I looked at the place where grief had been standing all day disguised as administration. I said, not sell it today. Lucas let out a breath that was almost a laugh and almost not. Rebecca sat down. She looked smaller somehow, not diminished but less defended. She said, Mom wrote that. About the house being yours in fact. Yes. She nodded once and looked at the table. Then, because no family reorders itself all at once no matter how compelling the paperwork, Caleb said the thing I suspect he had been circling since the moment Andrea Bell entered through the back door. If Dad felt that way, why didn't he just tell us? I answered before I had fully decided to. Because then you would have argued with him while he was alive, I said. And maybe because he didn't know how to explain that he had let one child pay twice for the same house. Once in money and once in blame. That ended the conversation for the day. Caleb left first. Not angrily, quietly. He picked up the realtor's card, looked at it, and put it in his jacket pocket without saying why. Rebecca asked whether I was staying the night. I said yes. Lucas offered to come back in the morning if I needed help sorting papers. I thanked him. He looked relieved to have something specific to offer that was not a defense of his own previous ignorance. By 7:30 the house was empty except for me. I walked through it room by room with my father's letters under my arm and the ledger in my hand. In the den, his glasses still sat on the side table beside the chair where hospice had found him sleeping more often near the end. In the hall closet, my mother's old umbrella was still hooked behind two coats that belonged to no one living. In the basement, the shelf over the workbench still held baby food jars of screws labeled in my father's handwriting. Drywall, trim, electrical, miscellaneous, though nothing in that house had ever been miscellaneous to him. I slept in the guest room that used to be mine and woke at 3 in the morning to the sound of the refrigerator cycling on, which was the same sound that used to carry through the house when I was a teenager lying awake trying to calculate whether I was a good daughter or merely a convenient one. The next morning I made coffee in my mother's percolator because no one had ever replaced it and sat at the kitchen table with the letters spread in front of me. By noon, Rebecca came back. She stood in the doorway doorway holding a paper sack from the bakery on Main Street and said, "I brought cinnamon rolls because I didn't know what else to bring." That, from my sister, was very close to an apology. We ate at the kitchen table under the same light where my parents once asked for my grandmother's money. We talked about ordinary things. Work, Emma's college applications, Rebecca's youngest moving into his first apartment, Lucas dating a woman who apparently found his inability to plan more charming than alarming. At one point Caleb asked whether I had ever considered adding a second bathroom upstairs, and I laughed so hard I startled myself. After dinner, we sat on the porch. The hydrangeas were long gone by then. The roof had been replaced. The air smelled like leaves and distant smoke. Rebecca said, quietly, "I still think about what Mom wrote, about the largest share of invisible labor." I said, "I know." She looked at her hands. "I'm trying not to do that to my boys. Make one the easy one and one the difficult one because it helps me organize the room." That, from Rebecca, was not a small sentence. Caleb said, "I think Dad did what he knew how to do in the end." Lucas said, "Late." Caleb nodded, "Yes, late." Then he looked at me. I said, "Late truths are still truths. They're just heavier to carry." No one argued. That is where the story rests now. Not in reconciliation exactly. Reconciliation is too neat a word for families that have spent decades learning the wrong lessons from each other. What we have is more careful than that and therefore, I think, more real. Caleb no longer talks about proximity as though it were virtue in itself. Rebecca invites instead of informs. Lucas asked before assuming. And I live in a house I was once told would not call me back, except it turned out the house had been mine in the ledger long before anyone spoke it aloud. Sometimes I stand at the kitchen sink in the late afternoon when the light angles through the window the way my mother loved, and I think about the 19-year-old who signed away her college money because she believed family need was a form of love that could not be negotiated. I want to reach back through time and tell her that usefulness is not the same thing as worth, that leaving is not betrayal when the place you leave has confused your sacrifice with its entitlement, and that one day the papers will finally say what the truth had already decided. My daughter is applying to colleges now. Her essays are spread across the dining room table. Her future is expensive in the ordinary way futures are expensive, but it is hers. Entirely hers. No family emergency, no roof, no practical request disguised as moral necessity will be built on top of it if I can help it. That may be the most direct inheritance my father actually left me, not the house itself. The final clarity about what a parent must not take from a child simply because the child is strong enough to survive the taking. The basil came back this year. I did not expect it to. I had cut it too late the previous season, neglected the soil, let the frost get closer than it should have. But in May there it was again, small and insistently green near the fence where my mother used to kneel with a chip cup of coffee balanced on the brick edge of the bed. I stood there that morning and thought about her note. A truth is not made less true because the documents are late. The documents were late. The apology was late. The invitation was late. But the truth, as it turned out, had been waiting in the house all along. That is my story. One funeral, one deed, one file hidden under a false panel, and a father who waited too long to say the necessary thing but said it clearly enough at the end that the people left living had to rearrange themselves around it. If this stayed with you, share it with someone who has ever been called the strong one and quietly charged for the privilege. Drop a comment and tell me whether you think late truth still counts if it comes after the damage. Hit subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.